On December 16, 1920, Japan began its first aircraft carrier. This was the 7,470-ton Hosho. Though originally intended to be a seaplane tender, she was redrawn as an aircraft carrier. While she was started after HMS Hermes, she was commissioned before her on December 27, 1922, making her the world's first purpose-built carrier. When commissioned, she was far from ready. Lots of equipment was still missing, some of it due to industrial limitations, some of it due to import delays. It wouldn't be until 3 months later that she would finally land an aircraft. Like Langley in the US, the Japanese received British help in designing and operating Hosho, but a lot more. A curious eyebrow-raising amount more. That's not to say the British did it pro bono, of course. While Japan and England had been allies since 1902, with the Japanese Navy basing itself on the Royal Navy, it was pretty clear to everyone that with the Soviet Pacific and Chinese fleets in shambles, it wouldn't be long before Japan's ambitions to be the power along the Pacific Rim would run into British interests there. Yes, the British fleet was larger and more capable than the Japanese fleet, but it also had a global empire to police, and it's a long way from Suez to Hong Kong. So why would the British help the Japanese? For one, money. World War I had really messed up the British economy. However, the main answer was the United States. At the time, the US and the British empires weren't enemies, but they weren't allies either. In fact, with the German Navy gone, the only navy in the world that could threaten the Royal Navy in the Atlantic was the US. At the same time, again, in the Western Pacific, Britain's largest threat was the Japanese. For the US's part, it realized the largest threat to its interest in the territories in the Western Pacific, the Philippines and China mostly, was the Japanese. And its largest threat in the Atlantic was the British. So the British were having financial problems. The US had spending limits imposed on it by a non-interventionist government, and the Japanese had a limited economy and industry. With British help, Japan could form a respectable but not overpowering corner in this three-way Mexican standoff, everyone keeping each other in check to maintain the status quo, where the one that shoots first gets ganged up on by the other two. And that's what did ultimately happen. But then the British plan got messed up by this guy, with the clear understanding by everyone that if it wanted, the US could outbuild the British and Japanese, not or, and the call went out. Gentlemen, this is expensive. Why don't you all come to Washington and we can discuss this? The outcome was the Washington Treaty. In regard to Anglo-Japanese relations, it was a grievous blow. The Japanese felt betrayed by their ally. Yes, they would continue to receive help from the British, but relations cooled as the British could see which way the economic wind was blowing. The death blow came in the early 30s when the militarists came to power. After that, Japan would go its own way. In general, Hosho shouldn't be thought of as a fleet carrier or even a light carrier, but rather as an experimental training carrier, because that's exactly what she was. Yes, she was perfectly serviceable when aircraft looked like this, wooden fabric biplanes, but when monowings came around, she was just too small and slow to be a viable fleet unit. In fact, for most of the war, she was used as a training ship in home waters, usually escorted by the equally elderly destroyer Ukazi. Her only operational deployment was during the Battle of Midway. Even then, she was way back with the battleships, carrying a mere 8 of the obsolete Type 96 B-4Y Jeans for ASW patrol and scouting. Being an experimental ship, she had what we would call, in retrospect, some oddities. One example was the bow of the flight deck angled downward to help speed up launching aircraft, kind of the reverse of the ski jump found on many modern carriers. Nice try, didn't work, but that goes back to the experimental part. Besides, you don't really want to put a ski jump on a ship with a propeller plane, do you? Another was the longitudinal or front-to-back arrestor wires. Again, these seem odd to us, but at the time, aircraft were so light with such a low landing speed that the concern wasn't stopping, but rather being blown off the side. A third was the funnels came out the side and then bent upward. When aircraft came in to land, the funnels would be lowered to the horizontal to keep smoke out of the landing path. This left more free deck space for aircraft. It was a practice that would show up on many carriers, and not just Japanese. Eventually, it was found to be needlessly complex and the funnels were fixed horizontally. A fourth was the divided hangar. She had 2 hangars, but rather than being stacked, they were front to back, each being serviced by one of the 2 elevators. The front hangar was only 1 level high and was mostly intended to handle fighters. The rear hangar was 2 levels high to handle the presumably larger attack planes as well as float planes. Remember, at the time, carriers were just seen as floating air bases, but also as seaplane tenders. She also had a small island on the starboard side, a reflection of British experience. Like other nations' first carriers, her hangar and flight deck were superstructure built on top of the hull. The final one I'm going to hit on was the fitting of 4 140mm low-angle guns. Such guns were the main armament on contemporary cruisers and were the secondary armament on battleships. Again, to us, 100 years later, this seems crazy. At the time, though, not so much. Remember, at the time, this whole aircraft thing was new and nobody was really sure how it would play out. This wasn't helped by the very limited range, payload, and communications of planes at the time. Doctrinally, carriers were seen more as scouting cruisers, supporting the battle line by using their aircraft to get a bird's eye view. Again, the range and payload of aircraft was very limited. Their ability to report when radios were a rarity even more so. However, it did mean carriers were often up front when war games were run. In fact, due to their slow speed and the necessity to churn into the wind for aircraft operations, they got sunk in surface actions. A lot. Keeping that in mind, it shouldn't be too surprising most early carriers had some type of medium low-angle guns, and for the same reason anti-aircraft guns were few and of limited ability, mostly meant to scare off the other side's snooping scouts rather than to truly defend the ship. Oh yeah, also remember radar was still considered science fiction. Of course, as aircraft got better and doctrine improved, things got pushed over the horizon and the need for anti-aircraft guns replaced the need for low-angle guns. And yes, there were a couple times carriers could really have used some heavy guns. Hosho was started December 16, 1920, and was completed December 27, 1922. Main armament was 4 140mm 50 caliber guns in single mounts, one at each front corner of the hangar under the flight deck. The other 2 were essentially midship with one on each side. Secondary armor was 2 80mm 40 caliber anti-aircraft guns on collapsible mounts in the flight deck in front of the rear elevator. Protection? No. Propulsion was provided by 8 boilers, 4 oil and 4 coal-fired, venting to the 3 funnels coming out the starboard side midship. These provided steam to the 2 turbines, each running a propeller. Together they generated 30,000 horsepower for a speed of 25 knots. She had 1 rudder. The flight deck was 168.25 meters by 22.62 meters and had 2 elevators. The forward one was 10.35 meters by 7.86 meters and serviced the forward hangar for fighters. The rear one was 13.71 by 6.34 meters and serviced the rear hangar for bombers and float planes. The forward hangar was 67.2 meters by 9.5 meters and 2.6 meters high. The rear hangar was 92 meters by 14 meters by 5 meters. Aircraft complement was 26. Modifications were kind of substantial. In 1924, the island was removed to free up deck space and reduce turbulence when landing. Remember, biplanes. The 80mm guns were moved forward. The longitudinal arresters were replaced with lateral ones, and the flight deck was straightened up at the bow. From 1935 through 1936, following the Fourth Fleet incident, like most other ships, she went in for a refit. The supports for the flight deck at the bow were stiffened and more were added. The longitudinal frame beams were also strengthened. The upper fuel tanks and the 80mm guns were removed. Permanent ballast was added, her coal boilers were converted to oil, and the funnels were fixed in the down position. This increased her weight to 10,797 tons. Speed fell to 21 knots. In 1939, her forward elevator was enlarged to 12.8 meters by 8.5 meters, and the rear one to 13.7 meters by 7 meters. Despite this, she was clearly no longer viable as a frontline unit and was essentially relegated to a training carrier. In October 1942, she was officially relegated to a training carrier, and her 140mm guns were removed. In April 1944, her flight deck was lengthened to 180.8 meters to allow the landing on and flying off of newer, larger aircraft for training. Surviving the war, she was scrapped in 1946.